Hey everyone, it's John Heath here again for Milton Rose Learning with another Let's Learn video on A Streetcar Named Desire, key characters. Okay, so we're going to have a really good look at a who's who and just give you the overview of the main kind of runners and riders, if I can put it that way, in this play. And then we'll look at audience response because a lot of these characters have been kind of reappraised and reinterpreted over time. So it's very good for your essays to track those changes. And then we'll look at just a nice key character arc and just see at kind of how one of the key characters has evolved over the play, which again is very good for your essays. So it should be a good one. So let's dive in. Okay, so number one, we've got a quick who's who. So let's just learn very quickly who the main characters are in A Streetcar Named Desire. So first one, we couldn't start without her. Okay, so Blanche DuBois. So she is a fragile, once quite wealthy Southern belle, clinging to illusions of refinement and romance. She represents, though, the decline of the Old South and the struggle to survive in a harsh modern world that was very much changing. American society was changing, but Blanche DuBois struggles to kind of traverse those changes. Then we have Stanley Kowalski. Okay, so he is a hardworking kind of working class man, proud, aggressive, but he's emotionally volatile, very volatile. So he represents the rise of the modern industrial kind of form of masculinity and brute strength and force and patriarchy and all of those kind of elements. Then we have Stella Kowalski, so that's Blanche's younger sister. She's emotionally torn between her past and her present life with Stanley, which is appalling. She represents a compromise between old world gentility and the realism of this new world, this new post-war American society that was starting to take shape. Okay, then we have Mitch, or Harold Mitchell, Stanley's friend and Blanche's brief love interest, kind but very emotionally limited. He represents the potential for tenderness in a harsh world, or the idea that romance may be possible, but also its limitations. Okay, she can never really bring anything together there. Okay, then we've got Eunice Hubble. So Eunice is Stella's upstairs neighbour and landlady, part of the working class New Orleans kind of setting. She represents resilience and the everyday reality of volatile relationships. Okay, a bit of a minor character, but nevertheless important. And then Steve Hubble is Eunice's kind of loud poker-playing husband, who mirrors Stanley's aggressive masculinity. He represents the rough working class kind of male culture of the quarter where they are. Okay, so that just gives you a very brief, just a very brief who's who, but quite useful just to get a grip on the characters. So let's make it a little bit more advanced. So we've got here a table where we have the key characters and then how a post-war audience would have seen those characters at the time, but also a modern day audience as well, because if you want the high marks, you want to try and talk about different audiences. Okay, so shall we start with Blanche DuBois? So we follow the table then. On the left, post-war audience. She would be seen as unstable and morally fallen, evoking pity, but also a bit of judgment as well. She's not living a life the way she should. But a more modern audience now, we're much more, I think, nuanced in our interpretation. Blanche would be viewed as a tragic victim of trauma, patriarchy as well, because we understand kind of feminist theory has taught us that, and also mental illness. Psychoanalytical theories would bring forward a much more sympathetic view of Blanche. Then we have Stanley. So on the left, the post-war interpretation. He, dare we say, may have been admired for his masculinity and dominance and that traditional kind of patriarchal gender role. But a modern day interpretation on the right would criticise him now for, I suppose, what we call toxic masculinity, violence and domestic abuse. It would be seen as extremely negative now. The interpretation has totally shifted around. Stella Kowalski, Post-war interpretation, she would be seen as a loyal wife, but she is caught between family and husband, unfortunately. But a more modern interpretation would pity her for her denial and an entrapment in an abusive relationship that she can't really escape from. So I think there is that kind of that progression in the interpretation of Stella. Harold Mitchell, post-war interpretation on the left, sympathised with as a decent man, disappointed by Blanche. But a more modern interpretation, he would be seen as initially kind, but he's also very weak and hypocritical. We're a little bit more cynical now as audiences for this play, and I do feel that, yeah, he would be seen as fairly hypocritical. Eunice Hubble, so post-war interpretation, post-war interpretation, a background figure reflecting working class loyalties. In the modern day, though, she would be seen as a cycle of abuse and silence, as well as what we might call erasure in an essay. Steve Hubble, then, at the time, audiences may have seen Steve as a familiar and relatable figure, typical kind of working class man. However, in the modern era, we would be much more likely to critique Steve's behaviour, in my mind, especially the way that conflict and shouting are kind of normalised in his relationship, which would make a modern day audience much more suspicious of him. So you can see there, can't you, that audiences change their interpretation of Streetcar Named Desire's characters over time. Don't forget that when you're writing your essays. It will really lead to a much more nuanced analysis. Okay, so now then, let's look at just a nice little character arc, and we'll look at Blanche DuBois and see how she changes over the narrative. Okay. So at the start of the text, we have Blanche DuBois. She arrives in New Orleans, dressed in white, very symbolic, appearing very fragile and refined, and she clashes with the raw setting of Elysian Fields. The characterisation then, she's introduced as delicate, pretentious and emotionally unstable, dare we say. And a great quote for this: her appearance is incongruous to this setting, looking as if she were arriving at a summer tea or cocktail party in the Garden District. The stage directions can be analysed just like the dialogue, never forget that. So she's very fragile at the start, and then we reach a turning point, don't we, in the middle of the narrative. So Stanley's dominance and violence. So Stanley asserts control through brute force and aggression, exposing Blanche's past and maintaining power over Stella. So the characterization here is it presents Stanley as primal, territorial and hypermasculine, symbolic of a brutal post-war America that was starting to evolve, and ultimately he's the one that causes the turning points that causes Blanche's mental illness and destruction almost. A quote that where he's kind of starting this journey off: every man is a king and I am the king around here, so don't forget it. Okay, so again, that's not going to play well with Blanche and the way in which she sees Stanley, and that's a real kind of turning point in the narrative. There are a number, but we've just chosen that one for the benefit of today's lesson. And then the characterization at the end is extremely tragic. So at the end of the text, we have Blanche's kind of mental breakdown. So after she's assaulted and rejected, Blanche loses her grip on reality and is taken away. So it highlights her complete psychological collapse. Blanche becomes a tragic figure, destroyed by a world unwilling to accept her fragility or past. And a really good quote for that: whoever you are, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. Okay, a very, very risky strategy, and ultimately shows the utter bankruptcy almost of Blanche's character. She has nowhere to go and nowhere to turn. Okay, unfortunately, a very tragic end. Okay, so Hopefully you've enjoyed that very quick kind of whistle-stop tour through A Streetcar Named Desire's characters. We've given you a quick who's who, just so you know the main characters in the play, obviously when you're studying it at school. Also just showed you how characters' interpretations can change over time. Very good for your essays, that is, and for your exams. And just took you on a very quick character arc about how Blanche kind of changes throughout the narrative and the turning point when Stanley kind of asserts his patriarchal power over her. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, tap the bell icon always to never miss another Let's Learn video again. If you have any comments, please do throw those into the comments and we'll always answer you on YouTube. And it just remains to say, obviously, thanks for listening and take care.